All right. My name is Matt McInerney. I'm the director of the Digital Scholarship Lab at Texas Tech University, and I'm the former chair of the Texas Data Repository Steering Committee. I'm pleased to welcome you to the next session in our series of webinars on topics in research data management. First, let me orient you to the Adobe Connect platform. At the top left, you should see the attendees pod where the names of the webinar hosts, presenters, and participants are listed. In the middle left, you'll see the chat pod where you can type your questions, comments, and links for everyone to see. You can also directly message individuals here. At the bottom left, you should see the download pod where we've shared a PDF of today's presentation and TDL's most recent annual report. You are welcome to download these documents at any time during the presentation. I'll give you a brief introduction to the Texas Data Repository, or the TDR. It's a multi-tenant Dataverse application launched by Texas Digital Libraries in the late 2016. Dataverse is an open source web application used to share, preserve, cite, explore, and analyze research data. There are 11 TDL member institutions who serve in the TDR steering committee, and they provide feedback and help make decisions on TDR services. The purpose of the steering committee is to provide strategic planning support and policy oversight to ensure the focus and direction of our programs and services. So, the Texas Digital Library and the Texas Data Repository Steering Committee have presented this free webinar series since 2018, showcasing topics in research data management and hosted by experts in academic libraries throughout North America. You can follow the link on the slide to view previous webinars and slides at your convenience. And before I hand things over to today's speaker, I want to remind everyone to please use the chat pod to ask your questions and leave comments. There will be a time at the end for Q&A. Leah and I will be monitoring the chat for any questions, and we'll call attention to them at the end. But now I'd like to introduce Daniella Lowenberg from the California Digital Library to present Make Data Count.
Thanks so much for having me. I think I spoke maybe a couple of years ago on this topic, but there's been so much that has changed, and I'm going to really start from the beginning here. So for those of you that I don't know, my name is Daniella. I'm at California Digital Library. I work as the project lead for Make Data Count, which is a Sloan Foundation funded initiative between CDL, DataCite, and Data One, these logos here. And I also act in another position as the product manager for Dryad, the data repository. So kind of from a high level, if we're going to talk about data metrics for a bit, it's important that we don't push past the idea of how do we even get data metrics, which means that something was published before that. And so we know here how important it is that we actually share data. You guys have the Texas Digital Repository. There are all these other repositories as well, and it's important that we always acknowledge how much things are changing. NIH said just yesterday that they're now thinking that their data policy will go into effect this summer, which will require DMPs and published data for anything that's funded by them. And we know that NSF has done the same. And of course, there's different kinds of repositories that I'm going to be referring to. The generals with logos that you might recognize here. And then, of course, disciplinary, where there are field-specific requirements that we want to make sure that's where the data is going, not to a general space when there is a field standard applied. And so we've seen an increasing emphasis on research data. I mean, even the fact that we're seeing new federal funders wanting to implement policies around this. And the problem is that we often refer to credit as an incentive for publishing research data, but we actually don't have credit for data right now. And this is because we don't have normalized approaches to actually evaluate data. And so without evaluation tools, we can't actually have credit. And so while we would love to be able to go to tenure committees and other and say, start looking at data as an output that we care about, we're just not there yet. And so I want to start by talking a little bit about um, data usage. And so the Make Data Count team has focused on kind of two primary things, and that's data usage and data citation. And this was because we did a survey in 2016 to researchers about what is it that you would actually care to hear back from about. And they said data usage and data citation were the big ones. And then Twitter and social media kind of fell off after that. But we know that that was 4 years ago, and the times have changed. We've seen such a rise in Twitter for science communication. And so while we haven't tackled that yet, it is something that we're looking to in the future. And so, why do we need to even talk about something like standardizing data usage? Well, here's a couple of screenshots from repositories of data sets. And if we wanted to be able to put on our resume or put in a grant application or understand, we'd say, can you compare numbers across repositories? And the answer is no, we can't, because we don't actually know how these numbers are calculated. And even though they're different data sets, it gets a little trickier too is once we can understand how they were calculated, what does it mean for each field? So what if this number here is from biomed, but this number over here is sociology? Is that actually something that we should be comparing? And so in 2017, members from the Make Data Count team worked in conjunction with Counter. And Counter is a standards organization that's worked within the article and book publishing world for a while to set standards on how you actually count usage of articles. And so we said we want to have something similar for data. And so we worked with them to actually talk through all of the differences that there are about data. And we know that there's just so many differences between them. So think about how you access data versus how you access an article. In the article world, it may not be normal at all to be using machines to access articles unless maybe you're doing a meta-analysis, where oppositely, using machines is a very normal way to access data. So we can't just off the bat say no to all machine access types. There's also the idea of data sets being versioned, which is a very normal practice, but not as normal. For articles, that's kind of a new phenomena. And also there's things like the fact that data sets can be derived and are granular. So there's different components of the data set that can be built up and put together, or data sets can be built off of multiple previously published data sets. And so how do you actually look at those? And that's the kind of stuff that we had to take into consideration when writing this code of practice. And so we put the first version out as a preprint in 2017, and then it was published on Counter's website in 2018 as a version 1. And so we know that gaming can always happen. That's something that can happen with any time that we say that there's a metric incentive. But we've looked at how we can reduce the number of double clicks that people do, like how many times does someone click in a minute, and also looked at bot inflation. And so we're really trying to put trust in some of these numbers, and we've already seen this, and I'll show an example in the next slide. But I will say that since maybe you've heard of the MDC project, or if you haven't, we're really thrilled that we've had so many repositories join in to standardize their numbers. And so the Data One Network, Dryad, Zenodo, Caltech Data, and now Dataverse have implemented. And so when Dataverse puts this onto their production, it actually means that Texas Digital Repository is going to be able to have that implemented and have the views and downloads in that way. And so here's an example that I wanted to show. We had recently relaunched Dryad onto a new platform here at CDL. And we see these numbers here. It's a little blurry, but you can see that they're massive numbers for the downloads. And then when we standardize it against the code of practice, these are the actual downloads total. And so, that number drops off from 50,000 to 1,000-ish. And why is that? It's because it is incredible how quickly a bot can inflate numbers. And so while this standardizing, and we may see this at the Texas Digital Repository when the numbers in the past are processed as well, is that a researcher doesn't want to see their numbers go down, but it's also really important that we're not overinflating things just because some bot got in there and was able to do that. So that's kind of the data usage realm, which is views and downloads. And so I know, I think on the Dataverse system, they just show downloads right now, but they'll begin to show views as well, because views, while we can't imply reuse from this, but we do want to show people how often their metadata are being looked at. And, beyond the general repository, we can think about how downloads and views kind of converge similarly. Say, if it was a crystallography repository and we see that 3D models are what are being stored, when you view it, you're actually using it. And so those are a lot of things that we have to think about, even if this is really baseline views and downloads, may not be the most exciting thing to be talking about. On the other hand, though, is data citation. And so that may be something that we hear about more, especially when people are referring to credit incentive, something that we should be doing. And so, here's an example of where it has worked, is that we can see the citations here. Then we click on it, we see on the citation list this article. And then if we go to the article, we can actually see in the citation list the data set that's there. And so what that actually means by data citation is that a researcher, when they publish their article, put their data set as a reference. But I want to stress that there's other ways that you can do this. And so, referencing your data set in your methods section is also a data citation. Reference list is the most formal way that you can do this. But we really want to urge that people are doing this often and not just relying on a data availability statement at an article to be able to index that information. And while this example I just showed works and is great, we do have a current problem, which is that right now a lot of publishers have not actually adopted the data citation guidelines. And so this is something where in the back end, when a journal submits their metadata and DOI to Crossref, we've seen a lot of times that they've stripped this information. And so while maybe we can see in the reference list this citation here, when we go into the XML of Crossref, which is a DOI metadata foundation for the article world, sometimes we can see an absolute blank in the XML. And so while it's super important that we advocate for researchers to do this, we also need to be thinking about advocating to publishers of how important it is that they mark up data citations, not just as references, but in their methods section as well, so that we can actually go back and be able to pull these out and show them at a repository level like so. Without this, we really can't know that we're going to get all this information back. So I mentioned, some other measures that we haven't spent as much time on, but some things that we want to think about are educational materials, Wikipedia, and different forms of Wikimedia, and Twitter. But we can also think of other ways that we would want to start encompassing how we're looking at data. And so, in the articles, it's been a very traditional world. We've looked at views, downloads, citations, and then the rise of alt metrics came. And so while we're really in the beginning steps here of building out data metrics, we want to be thinking about what are other ways that we could capture the impact and reach of research data. And we really have the opportunity now to build it from the ground up, which a group of bibliometricians we were working with recently said, that's just not an opportunity that we ever had for articles. Impact factor and other were just built out early, and that's what was adopted. And so right now we're really trying to rethink how can we build data metrics from the start in a way that actually makes sense and rewards open research and research data reuse without disincentives. And so while I've just mentioned these counts, standardizing views, downloads, showing the citations, it's really important to stress that these counts are not actually data metrics. And so, why is that? What is a metric? Well, a metric actually implies meaning. And so right now we can't even compare data usage numbers, and we're not seeing all the data citations we need to see. But more importantly, on top of that, as I kind of alluded to earlier, we actually don't understand researcher behavior yet. Why does a researcher download but not cite a data set? Why does a researcher cited data set, but they only downloaded one portion of that whole data set. What does it mean between different disciplines? So, within sub-disciplines, does it change at all? And so understanding all of these researcher behaviors are essential so that we don't pre-assign meaning and right now just off the bat say that the number of citations you have is a metric and that is what is important. And a good example to think about that is thinking how many papers are actually produced or how many data sets are produced in that field. It would be unfair to just say that it's the number of citations if that field only has 10 papers a year, say. And so how do we actually get there? So, the first couple years of Make Data Count, it had started initially as an NSF eager grant, and that's what kicked off the research into what it is that researchers would actually want for this. Then the next phase of it was a Sloan Foundation grant, which we are just coming off of now, that was looking at the infrastructure. So how do we build this counter code of practice? How do we have a standardized way for data usage? How do we advocate to publishers? And what we realized is that there's kind of a broader story arc that we need to be focusing on. And so step one of that is participation. So there are tons of community initiatives around data citation and data usage that are happening. Research Data Alliance, the RDA, has hundreds of working groups, one of them on data usage, one of them on data citation, other ways around community support for these. And so what we want to make sure is that we're building on these successes instead of reinventing the wheel and trying to restart these conversations. And so we can also see that there's commercial competitors that can come in this space and tell us right now, which they have been, that they have data metrics ready. We can purchase them now. And the more support we can put into these building block community initiatives, the more we can ensure that we're not going to go to a system where we just default to a data impact factor. Step two is that it needs to be transparent. And so that's why we've been working to make sure that the code of practice actually makes you report these transparent numbers. We need to be able to understand how things were counted and how things are being displayed. This is something that we don't have with articles. We don't actually know how the impact factor and the H-index are being calculated, where those numbers are coming from. We've also seen with data metrics, commercial providers that have recently come out, we don't know where those numbers are coming from. And so groups that want to come up with a data impact factor, we've asked them, what's that calculation? Where's it coming from? And they say, well, it's actually our proprietary calculation. And that's something that we should inherently not trust without knowing that. The next, as I was saying about these studies, is that we need to look at bibliometrics principles. So one thing we're acknowledging is that we as infrastructure providers are not bibliometricians. We're not infometrics people. And so we want to understand what is meaningful for data. And while we said we started with data usage and data citation as important building block steps, we actually don't know what the right indicators for data are yet. And so we're really excited going forward. We're going to be working with a group of bibliometricians that were involved in altmetrics and other open initiatives recently. They're based, it's about 4 bibliometricians we'll be working with. They're based in different countries around the world. And they're going to start kickstarting these studies, talking to researchers, doing qualitative and quantitative analyses on what is meaningful, how do researchers use data, how do researchers share data, and that kind of information and publishings will actually help us as a community start to understand what is meaningful and what we should actually work towards without just defaulting to the factors that we've used for articles. The fourth is the importance of qualitative assessment. So, all of what I've been saying is really focused on numbers. So like the logs of how people access and how much they're accessing something or referring to it. But it's also important that we think about qualitative assessment here. So curation of data sets and peer review of data sets are both absolutely required for us to be promoting data sharing. Both, I would say, are not common practice. Maybe curation has a little bit more because repositories are investing in that. But peer review of data is just not really happening in a way that we want to see it. In my previous role, I was at PLOS, the open science publisher, and We did many studies trying to see what we could change to get the reviewers to actually look at the data, even when we provided it, and we just couldn't get reviewers to spend time looking at that. And so we need to start thinking about other initiatives that we can do to start pushing for this to happen, because we don't want to just evaluate data based on numbers. We want to make sure that the scientific merit and soundness is also being assessed. We can see this, the phenomena of a data set or an article that has something flawed in it gets hundreds of tweets, thousands of tweets. They can get thousands of downloads because people want to look at what that flaw was. And so we want to take that into consideration and not just assume that a high count means something for data. And last is that we need to come together as a community on this. So there's the saying of Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. We have to remember that metrics can change behavior. And so if we just institute something and it changes researcher behavior, we could be changing a lot of what's happening in science in a negative way. And so we need to work with the research community and then adapt and iterate once we see how these metrics built out are actually affecting their work, and vice versa. And that's really important so that we don't just come off the bat with something that we think is right and it turns out that it's not. And as much as community here could mean, the libraries coming together on this, it's essential that we bring the research community in when we get to this point. And so, I've just gone through a whole bunch of ways, almost preaching how we should be working on certain things. So how can we all work on this? Repositories, it's essential that we get these normalized numbers for views and downloads. And so a big portion of what we're going to be focusing on for repositories in the future is figuring out easier ways that we can implement the counter-code practice for them. For publishers, we want to be focusing on them properly indexing data citations. For funders, we want to make sure that funders are actually telling researchers to use best practice repositories and having normalized numbers like, now Dataverse has a place that is best practice because these numbers are so essential. And then for institutions, just thinking about the above implementations, who you're working with and how you can be supporting these messages and promoting them within your communities. And for researchers, if there's any that are on the webinar today or thinking about, when you're working with researchers in the future, I know, of course, I mentioned that we have a problem with publishers indexing, but it's really essential that we also still promote the message for researchers to cite their data. And so there's plenty of ways that this can happen. It can happen in journal articles, preprints, in other data publications, or in code archiving. So a data citation can be the reference to. So when you publish your data, put the reference to other data sets or your code or other materials in those data sets. And in blogs, Wikipedia, educational materials, there's other ways that we can start to grab these citations and show them back. So the more common practice it is to cite data, the more that we can actually get that together. And there was actually an interesting thread on Twitter the other week from, I think the Paleontological Society put out a tweet saying, researchers, do you cite your data and on your resume, why or why not? And I should have pulled those results for this slide, but I can follow it up to send it along. But it's interesting kind of what that perspective has been on it. And so just showing that so many repositories are now pushing for the citation of this and prominently showing the citation of the data set instead of the related article. And so this is great, but the more we can push for this, the better. You can see Texas Data Repository on here as well. So, making it prominent is great. And then the next step is actually pushing for researchers to do this. And so I've just gone through a whole bunch of things, and what I'd say is that we're still trying to understand further use cases and the needs and values that we should be building for. We have a broad community within the Make Data Count group that's opened up with open newsletter and webinars and ways to get involved. We have the RDA Data Usage Metrics Working Group and the Scholar Citation Working Group that can be joined, but we also want to hear directly we want to make sure that we're not just building for specific use cases or needs. And so it'd be great to hear your thoughts and other things that we can be including as we build for this. And I'm just going to close by saying that we wrote a longer form. We did a book sprint, which is a 5-day locked in a house writing a book experience, and published this open ebook that I put a link to here, opendatametrics.org, takes you to Zenodo to an open ebook or PDF, where we kind of go through more of this background information. It's a little less about make data count specifically and a little more about these other steps. We go into the kind of flaws we can see, traps that we can fall into, and just kind of a broader perspective on it. And with that, I know I just rushed through a lot, but a lot of time for questions if you have them.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Daniela. We'll open up for questions now. I will look at the chat box for what people have written down. Right. Justin White asks, when publishers are removing cross-ref metadata, is there a separate field in cross-ref for data citations that the citation to the dataset's DOI doesn't cover, such as a separate field?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of ran through that really quickly. When a publisher sends their metadata to Crossref, they mark up specific types of things. And so it's truly putting, like brackets and saying data citation, and then that goes before the reference. And because they're not adding and marking up in the XML, that is the data citation, that's why it gets stripped in the end. It's a very small task, but implementing one thing across hundreds of journals is what has stopped publishers from prioritizing this. But we've seen it successful. eLife, Hindawi, and some other publishers have been really great at promoting this. And Crossref has some information on their website about how to do it right.
All right, Texas State University asks, are y'all using Counter 4 or Counter 5?
We are using our own counter. It's called the Counter Code of Practice for Research Data. It's most similar to Counter Code of Practice version 5, but if you go to the Counter website and you click Counter Code of Practice Research Data, you will see it is their newest publication.
Awesome. Any other questions? Courtney is typing. All right, Courtney asks, what is the number one thing that TDR liaisons can do to engage their faculty better towards collecting better research data metrics?
That is a great question. I think for faculty, the focus would be on publishing their data somewhere where the usage is being counted properly. And best yet is for them to cite their data and for them to publish in open access journals, et cetera. Basically, as many open systems as can be leveraged, the more that we're going to be able to pull this information back. And so everything that's being sent, once it's standardized by the Code of Practice, we've also written a reporting format. So like data or articles send their information to Crossref, data centers can send their information to DataCite, and DataCite and Crossref actually pull together their information. And so DataCite and Crossref have been working on aggregation, so we could pull by institution, by ORCID, by funder, and we can actually start to see the aggregates of these counts. And so the more we can push for people to actually be publishing in places that use DataCite Crossref and these open infrastructures, the more that we're going to be able to get out of it and see and work with. And I'm putting a link to the Twitter thread in the chat box if anyone wants to look at that. That was the one I was referring to about, do you cite your data on your CV? It's an interesting poll.
Great. Any other questions for Daniella? Give it just one more minute. All right. Well, thank you so much, Daniella. Thank you to Texas Digital Libraries and the. Oh, sorry.
There's a question.
Yes. Alec K says, any advice for institutions considering setting up their own repository, say with the Dataverse architecture?
Yeah, so we've been working really closely with Dataverse to get them to instate this for any of their repositories that use their architecture. And so if you do go with them, this will be covered, which is great. If you go with your own route or other, you're more than welcome to get in touch with us, and we can actually implement the code of practice with you when you're setting up the repository. Or if you have a repository that's already been living and you want to back process or implement that, we can also do that.
All right. Anybody else? For anybody, a reminder in that just a reminder that the TDR is a Dataverse repository, and we are always looking to grow our membership. You can join the club. All right. Well, there are no more questions. Thank you very much, Daniella. Thank you to Texas Digital Libraries and the TDR Steering Committee for coordinating the topics and research data webinar services or series. And many thanks to Jessica Trey Logan for curating this webinar for us. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.